From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
President Biden rolls out long-awaited tariffs on some Chinese imports, including EVs, semiconductors, batteries, and solar cells, while keeping the Trump-era tariffs in place. We'll have part of our conversation with U.S. Trade Representative Katherine Tai and reaction today from China trade expert Anna Ashton of Ashton Analytics.
And cross-examination begins for Donald Trump's former fixer, Michael Cohen, in the hush money trial. We'll have analysis from former Watergate prosecutor Nick Akerman.
And as Trump supporters, including the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, Governor Doug Burgum, Congressman Byron Donalds, and Vivek Ramaswamy all crowd the courthouse today, we'll have reaction from our political panel. These images, for those of us on Bloomberg TV watching this, are quite remarkable. All matching today at the courthouse, Kaylee, with some real political firepower in lower Manhattan. But we're also watching what's happening today here in Washington with some important news on our relationship with China.
Yeah, news we saw coming, but news nonetheless. President Biden announcing that all tariffs under the Trump administration that were put in place years ago will be staying in terms of Chinese imports, and many of them will actually be raised. The president saying all of this essentially is about leveling the playing field, making sure that it is fair for American workers and manufacturers trying to produce these products. And he spoke about this from the Rose Garden earlier today.
Sometimes they just outright steal through cyber espionage and other means. And it's been well documented and internationally recognized. And when you make tactics like these, you're not competing. It's not competition, it's cheating.
President Biden at the White House earlier today, as you saw and heard live on Bloomberg. We turn now to Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams, who leads our national security coverage here in Washington. Nick, interesting tactic here following visits to Beijing by the Secretary of State, by the Treasury Secretary. The reaction is already a big no from China on this one. What's the administration trying to do with our trade relationship?
Well, there are a couple of competing priorities here. One is the issue of wanting to maintain a relationship with China, but also wanting to correct, as the president says, this imbalance between the fact that, look, China does this a lot. I mean, Chinese tariffs on U.S. goods are sky high, so there's a natural disadvantage there for U.S. goods. But at the same time, a lot of this is pretty symbolic. I mean, you mentioned EVs. China does not really export any EVs into the United States. So I think what you're seeing here more is a signaling attempt to hit China in an area where it sees a large prospect of growth, but also looking to head off what the administration thinks could be coming later on. So listen, we're basically telling you right now we are closing the door on Chinese EVs. So I don't think you're going to see a huge economic impact in the U.S. from these now, but it's really sending a signal of where the administration is heading and what they don't want to see coming from China in the future.
Well, I guess it's a question of whether China is going to start closing doors in response. This is actually something we asked U.S. Trade Representative Katherine Tai about earlier today on Bloomberg Television, and this is what she told us.
We are interested to see how China responds. We have indicated to China that this is not an intention to escalate or even to confront. It really is on our side a set of defensive measures when taken together with the investments that we are making here in green and clean technology.
Not the intention to escalate, Nick, but certainly China could escalate if it so chooses. We asked Katherine Tai what the worst case scenario is here, essentially, in terms of China's response. She didn't want to speculate as to that. What would it be, though?
I mean, I think when you look at these tariffs, the sky's the limit. You look to President Biden's competition for 2024. Former President Donald Trump has said he wants to put in 60% tariffs on China if he comes into office. And the Bloomberg projection is essentially that would drop Chinese exports to the United States to zero. So, I mean, this could get a lot worse. So I think what you're seeing right now really is much more of a sort of symbolic shot across the bow for the Biden administration.
The White House seems to be bristling today at the idea of this being framed as a trade war. Well, and while China was in the air at the White House today, and certainly the topic of discussion, the Secretary of State was overseas, Antony Blinken, moving from his shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East to Kyiv today as a show of support for Ukraine.
I have come to Ukraine with a message. You are not alone. The United States has been by your side from day one. We are with you today, and we will stay by your side until Ukraine's security, its sovereignty, its ability to choose its own path is guaranteed.
Nick, the money's out the door, the weapons are being sent. Why the visit now? Who's the audience?
I mean, Ukraine is certainly the audience there, as well as Republicans back home. I mean, it's an incredible message from Secretary Blinken. We spent the last 6 months wondering when this money was going to come, and finally they unlocked it, and the administration is essentially privately saying, listen, there is no prospect you guys are going to get any more money at year's end once this $60 billion runs out. So, you know, of course he's going to go and say, we stand by your side, you're not alone. But looming over all of this is essentially this sort of Damocles that's like, we are not going to have a ton more money for you. And you look at what may happen if Trump comes in. I mean, a lot of questions there. I would not be very surprised if Ukraine was not terribly reassured by this message from the Secretary of State.
All right, Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams, who leads our U.S. national security coverage here in Washington. Thank you so much. Let's turn now to New York and the criminal trial of Donald Trump and continue testimony of his former attorney and fixer, Michael Cohen, today. The defense got its chance at Cohen in cross-examination. That will continue later on this week. But there were also a few other big names and supporters of Trump in attendance at court today, including the House Speaker.
I called President Trump and told him I wanted to be here myself to call out what is a travesty of justice, and I think everybody around the country can see that. President Trump is a friend, and I wanted to be here to support him.
That was Mike Johnson there. Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson is joining us now. So, Wendy, the Speaker of the House, very high up there on the presidential line to succession,
yes,
shows up at the courthouse in defense of a former president. Is it that Donald Trump needed Mike Johnson there, or Mike Johnson needed to go there to make sure he stays in the favor?
Well, it's a very savvy question, Kelly, and the answer is Mike Johnson needs Donald Trump. And all these Republicans who have been there this week holding these news conferences outside the courthouse, they're all helping Donald Trump first through the gag order. He can't complain about the trial anymore. An appeals court today upheld his gag order. And so he's getting surrogates to do it for him, to say all the things that you just heard Mike Johnson saying. However, these guys also want Donald Trump to like them, to support them, and in many cases, not Mike Johnson's, but in the rest of their cases, to pick them to be his running mate and to be vice president of the United States. Mike Johnson needs Trump to back him if there's any more revolts among his conference to kick him out of office. So this was Veep stakes being played out, you know, audition, apprentice style, right there in front of the Manhattan courthouse. And it's so different than it was in years gone by when if a politician was in trouble, his friends abandoned him immediately. In this case, they're all still there saying, I want to be part of this.
Even wearing matching suits.
Even wearing matching suits. That was really amazing.
Serious color coordination, almost at a central casting. So imagine being the witness. And, of course, today that was Michael Cohen, and he's got his own baggage and story to tell about Donald Trump here. But to see the optics here, the extent to which this would intimidate a witness, has to be mentioned. Imagine being in the witness box of the Speaker of the House and other elected officials are striding down the aisle to support the former president. And as we just heard, Mike Johnson called this a travesty of justice.
Absolutely, which is, if Donald Trump said that right now, he'd be in Rikers, right, which is what the threat is hanging over his head and why he needs these friends to come say this stuff for him for the political thing. But you're absolutely right on the witness intimidation. There was that moment today where Michael Cohen is on the stand testifying that Trump, you know, was well behind the payment to Stormy Daniels. In other words, making the prosecution's case for them, that he signed off on this hush money payment. And the courtroom doors swing open, and there's half the Republican leadership and governors of states and, you know, and all of that standing there in Donald Trump's same outfit, the blue suit, the white shirt, the red tie, and they're all standing there staring at him. I mean, it seemed like witness intimidation to me.
But not breaking any rules, though, to
not
be clear,
breaking
right?
a single rule. They are absolute. The court's open to the public.
Just like the rule is that Donald Trump has to be in the courtroom every day of this trial. He will not have to be tomorrow. It's on break. Thursday, though, they will come back, resume the cross-examination of Michael Cohen. But the prosecution says this is the last witness they're calling. Things could potentially wrap up in pretty short order, Wendy, and we could be reaching that make or break moment of whether or not Donald Trump ends up acquitted or a convicted felon well before the Republican convention.
Absolutely. And then what we'll have to see is, does it matter? I mean, all these people still are banking on being his running mate, whether or not he's a convicted felon. It's very highly unlikely he'll go to prison because he'll appeal, and if he is convicted, it's a very good chance he'll be acquitted. So they're all gambling on this turning out for him, and so far it's helped him electorally. So
yeah, and then the question will become, when do we hear from the Supreme Court on Donald Trump's immunity claim?
Yeah, certainly by June 30th. So June's going to be fun.
Here. It sure will. Yet another month. We look forward to it with Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson. Thank you, Wendy. Coming up on Balance of Power, we look back as the defense indeed got its turn now at Michael Cohen. The cross is underway, and former federal prosecutor Nick Akerman will join us next to discuss. This is Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and radio.
Do you plan to testify, Mr. Trump?
Thank you very much. As you know, I'm under a gag order, so I can't really answer those very simple questions that you're asking. I'm under a gag order. Nobody's actually seen anything like it. But we talk about subjects we're allowed to talk about. Would love to not be in the gag order. I'm the Republican nominee for president. I'm leading in every poll, and I have a gag order.
Donald Trump on his way out of the courthouse today in Lower Manhattan as an appeals court denies his gag order repeal request once again. Michael Cohen on the stand facing defense lawyers in court today for the first time. We're joined now by Nick Akerman, former Watergate prosecutor who has helped us walk through this process since it began. Mr. Akerman, welcome back. It's great to see you. Much has been made today of the fact that the Speaker of the House, along with several pretty bold names from the world of politics, including Congressman Byron Donalds, Governor Doug Burgum, a series of folks who are vying to be Donald Trump's vice presidential pick. They all showed up at court today. We saw Senator Rick Scott there a couple of days ago. And I wonder, to the extent that you might see this as potentially intimidating to a witness, if you were in court, would you try to have them removed?
I don't think so. I think Michael Cohen can handle this himself. If I were there as his attorney or as the prosecutor, I just don't think it's going to make a difference. Michael Cohen, from what I gather, is looking at the jury. He's focused on the questions, and I don't see this really impacting his testimony.
Okay, so let's talk about his testimony and the questions he was asked, what his responses were. Obviously, when the prosecution was questioning him, we heard things we have heard before. Pretty much exactly what everyone expected Michael Cohen would say about the way in which the payments to Stormy Daniels and others were made. But when the defense got its turn at cross-examination, one question, yes or no, do you want to see Trump convicted in this case? He said, sure. He was also asked if he had said about Donald Trump in the past, did you call him a Cheetos-dusted cartoon villain? And he says, that sounds like something I might have said. How easy is this for the defense to make him look like someone with a vendetta, not a credible witness?
Well, I got to tell you, at this point, the case is pretty much over. Michael Cohen walked into this with everybody having already supported what he said on his direct. What they do with him on cross at this point is almost irrelevant. What you've got here is not just one accomplice witness, but you've got two accomplice witnesses. And as someone who's not only been a criminal prosecutor, but also a criminal defense lawyer, the problem that the defense has here is that this is just not a case of Michael Cohen versus Donald Trump. It's really a case of two cooperating witnesses, David Pecker and Michael Cohen versus Donald Trump, supported by lots of documentation, supported by other witnesses like Hope Hicks and Mr. McConaughey from the Trump Organization. So the problem that the defense has here is that they don't really have a theory of the case to argue to the jury. To say that Michael Cohen wants to see him go to jail, doesn't like him, has a vendetta, it's all kind of a lot of noise and smoke in relation to the fact of what the prosecution has proved in this case, which is a very simple situation where there was a catch and kill scheme that was created with the National Enquirer, with David Pecker, Donald Trump, and Michael Cohen, that they went after one woman to get her to sign a confidentiality agreement. They went after Stormy Daniels. They went after the doorman, Dino, who signed a confidentiality agreement. And there are all these documents that support it. If you go on the New York court website, you can actually look at every single one of these transcripts and every single one of these documents. The documents themselves almost make the case. So the problem is, if you look at Todd Blanche's initial opening statement and what his defense is, most of it's been blown away except for the fact that he's claiming that Michael Cohen is a liar. Now, that would work if it was just Michael Cohen versus Donald Trump, but it's not. It's all of these other documents, not to mention a tape recording in which Donald Trump is overheard speaking to Michael Cohen about trying to buy back the rights to one of the women whom the National Enquirer paid money to keep her silent. So you've got Donald Trump on tape. In effect, he's a witness. You've got all of these other witnesses, and you've got the defense without a real theory of their case, not something that they can argue other than to say Michael Cohen is a liar. And at this point, when they're putting Michael Cohen on, almost everything Michael Cohen says fits right into the theory that they have presented right from the beginning with David Pecker, straight through with all of the other witnesses, including books written by Donald Trump, things he said, the documents that are included. So this is, I think the defense is really at the end of the rope at this point.
Well, bring us inside the jury here. We don't talk about the jury often. We don't have cameras in the courtroom. We don't get a chance to see the reaction. Nick, during the session this morning, you referred to Michael Cohen as a liar a couple of times here. He actually took the time to apologize. He apologized to the American people for lying to them, as he said, for acting in a way that suppressed information. Does a move like that, I suspect it was recommended by his lawyers, actually impact the jury?
Oh, I would think so. I mean, look, I think the jury at this point is so sensitized to this because they've heard all of these other witnesses that Michael Cohen made a good presentation on his direct. There hasn't been anything, at best I can tell, from just reading the press reports. And I emphasize reading the press reports. I might have a completely different opinion if I were actually sitting in that courtroom and could actually view the jury, because when you're trying a case, obviously you're looking at the jury, you're trying to gauge the reaction. And we can't do that here unless we're actually in that courtroom. But based on the kind of cross that was done, I just thought it was pretty mundane, was not real powerful. And when you take it in light of the fact that he's the last witness, and everybody knew what he was going to say, and he said it, and it's all corroborated, and you've got Donald Trump on tape, and you've got all these documents, I just don't think it's going to make that much of a difference, no matter what they do on Thursday.
All right. Nick Akerman, former Watergate prosecutor, thank you so much, as always, for your insights. We appreciate it. Now, still ahead on Balance of Power, April's producer price index coming in hotter than expected. But what will tomorrow's CPI numbers bring? Bloomberg Economics' Stuart Paul joins us next on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
The first quarter in the United States was notable for its lack of further progress on inflation. We had higher readings in the first quarter and higher than we expected. We did not expect this to be a smooth road, but these were higher than I think anybody expected. And so what that has told us is that we'll need to be patient and let restrictive policy do its work.
Fed Chair Jerome Powell preaching patience earlier today. As we look at inflation data that came in hot in terms of PPI today, and tomorrow brings the big one. April's CPI report. Joining us now for more is Stuart Paul of Bloomberg Economics. So, Stuart, obviously there were perhaps some caveats to the hot data today. Certainly we saw the markets shrugging it off. CPI, though, as we have seen evidence time and again, has the power to move markets in a very material way. What should we be bracing for come 8:30 a.m.?
It's still going to be a very slow pace of disinflation in the April report. We're expecting to see annual headline CPI slowing from about 3.5% to 3.4%. We're expecting to see annual core inflation slowing just a little bit more from 3.8 to 3.6. But if we look at the core number, if we look at it on a monthly basis, it's still going to be about 0.3% month on month. On an annualized basis, that's still not even close to the Fed's 2% inflation target. And when we factor in some of the key items within the PPI report that we saw today, it ends up pointing to core PCE inflation that is a similar 0.3%, again, not even close to the Fed's target.
Stuart, when the Fed chair was asked in that forum about today's data, he said he wouldn't call it hot, he'd call it mixed. He referred to revisions and seemed to be striking a slightly different tone than some of the more hawkish lines that came out of this presentation today. To what extent is he projecting for the market?
So, look, just when it all nets out, it was definitely a hot print with PPI today, with the producer prices. If you look under the hood, we saw some items. We saw financial services, we saw food services, we saw medical care services. They were all way too hot. They were offset in some degree. They were offset partially by a decline in airfares. And those all go into the PCE inflation measure that I mentioned before. So if Powell is looking at how those specific items then map into PCE inflation, I could see how he could call it mixed. But if we're really just looking at the numbers as they are, one would have to really just acknowledge the truth. It was a hot PPI print today.
Stuart, we just have 30 seconds. Today, we also got a slew of tariff increases from the Biden administration. That going to have a real impact on inflation?
Very limited effect on inflation. I really have to commend you guys for doing a phenomenal job with your discussion with Catherine Tai today. As you guys brought up during your interview, and I'd recommend everybody go and watch that, the extent to which the imports that we are taking in from China that are subject to tariffs, it's just about $18 billion worth of goods. And if you think about how much we're doing in terms of imports on a monthly basis, we're looking at about $70 billion. It's a drop in the bucket.
Hey, Stuart, it's always great to have you. Thanks for joining from New York. Stuart Paul, Bloomberg economics expert, on the data coming up, how Biden's new tariffs on Chinese imports will impact our relationship with Beijing. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
Chinese government has poured state money into Chinese companies across a whole range of industries: steel and aluminum, semiconductors, electric vehicles, solar panels. The industries of the future, pushing Chinese companies to produce far more than the rest of the world can absorb, and then dumping the excess products onto the market at unfairly low prices.
President Biden earlier today in the Rose Garden at the White House, just before he signed the new China tariffs. Now that they have his signature, what does the increase mean for China and U.S. relations? Joining us now is Anna Ashton, former Department of Defense Intelligence and founder of Ashton Analytics. It's great to see Anna. Welcome back. To the extent that I'm aware, I can't go to the store and buy a Chinese EV. To what extent was this messaging versus effective policy?
Right, Joe. I mean, I think, first of all, it's good to see you, too. I think it is fair to say that it's largely messaging at this point. That doesn't mean that there's not a strategic goal in mind here with the Biden administration. But the reality is that very few Chinese EVs have been making it onto the U.S. market anyway, both because of pre-existing tariffs and because of the fact that, very few Chinese EVs have been exported to date. They actually don't seem to have a ton of overcapacity when it comes to EVs.
Well, the overcapacity issue and the idea that maybe this is, in fact, just trying to get ahead of China dumping a bunch of product onto the market was something that U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai spoke with Joe and I about earlier today on Bloomberg TV. China's export model specifically, this is what she told us.
concern that China is doubling down on its export-led model of growth to try to lead the Chinese economy out of its current downturn by manufacturing beyond the demand required in China and pumping goods out into the global market.
But Anna, when we think about what some of these goods actually are, this is stuff that the U.S., especially if it's pursuing a green transition climate agenda, is going to need access to, including things like batteries and critical minerals that we are still reliant on China for. Is this at risk of backfiring?
Kayleigh, I think that it is at risk of backfiring because of the fact that, while it is understandable that the Biden administration wants to continue to ensure that there is adequate diversification of U.S. supply chains, that there's not over-reliance on China. And while it's reasonable to look at what China's doing domestically to bolster its economy and its emphasis on these strategic industries, manufacturing more products and then selling them to foreign markets, the reality is that some of these things, like critical minerals, like lithium-ion batteries, are things that the United States doesn't remotely begin to produce for itself in particular, in any particular significance, and that it can't really get away from sourcing from China in the near term. And in order to do that, it would have to bring online a lot of mining, a lot of processing, both at home and with partners and allies faster than it is currently set up to do.
It's really something, Anna, we talk about this, and I've been hearing the name Donald Trump. I've invoked the name a couple of times as well, because we have to note that the Biden administration did not lower a single Trump-era tariff and thus tacitly endorsed them. And as we try to find sunlight between these two administrations' approaches, I talked about it with Gene Sperling earlier today, President's economic advisor, and asked him about the difference. He sees it quite differently, by the way. Here's what he said.
There just couldn't be a greater difference. First of all, let's even just look at the results. Our trade deficit with China is right now the lowest it's been in a decade, lower than any of the 4 years under the previous administration.
Anna, Ashton, is that a fair comparison or not?
I just think that it kind of dodges the question. The reality is that basically all of the tariffs do remain in place. Do they remain in place for exactly the same reasons that the Trump administration put them in place? The Trump administration's original goal was to balance the trade deficit. The Biden administration hasn't spent a lot of time emphasizing that, despite that statement that you got today. I think that the tariffs remain in place pretty clearly because of the fact that they continue to encourage U.S. companies to figure out alternative sourcing, alternative supply chains to, reduce their dependence on China, which is a long-term strategic goal of the United States, according to both parties at this point. But, are tariffs enough? No. And the Biden administration is also different from the Trump administration in its use of export controls, which has been a major emphasis.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Anna. And as we consider China's likely response to this, if anything could be done in retaliation in terms of tariffs being put on U.S. exports, for example, I also wonder not just the ways in which China could retaliate, but ways in which China could actually get around a lot of this, like, say, send cars through Mexico.
That's a really good point, Kayleigh, because we certainly have seen lots of signs that China is doing just that, whether it's, driven by some central government authorization or not. The fact of the matter is that as some U.S. producers and U.S. affiliated producers have sought to diversify away from China for manufacturing for the U.S. market, their Chinese suppliers who are manufacturing the things that they need have in many cases followed them to places like Vietnam and Mexico. So I do think that that's something that we might see.
Pretty remarkable to see on the terminal today. As a matter of fact, BYD debuting its first truck in Mexico today. Anna, what do these new tariffs mean potentially for Elon Musk? Is he in trouble in China?
I don't want to speculate about what exactly will happen to Elon Musk. It's hard to say. He did seem to have a pretty positive visit to China recently. But in terms of, what China could use to respond, we know that China likes to be reciprocal in response to these sorts of actions. And the tricky thing is that because there is a trade deficit and because what we trade with each other isn't isn't exactly the same. It's not easy to point to exactly what China will do. Yes, they could impose tariffs on U.S. goods entering the Chinese market, but what goods? I think agricultural goods are always a big target because they make up the bulk of what is in demand in China from the U.S., but they have backfired in the past. So I think, we also might see something like ratcheting up of the existing export license restrictions on graphite, which is critical to lithium-ion batteries, because of the fact that the export license restriction is there and hasn't necessarily impeded trade yet, but could easily be used as a tool to squeeze the U.S.
All right, Anna Ashton, thank you so much, as always, for joining us. We appreciate your time. And coming up, we'll have more on this with our political panel. They'll weigh in not just on the politics of Donald Trump's ongoing criminal trial in New York, but also the domestic politics that are at play with President Biden's tariff order today. And Biden took a little bit of a bite out of Donald Trump in the Rose Garden earlier in that regard.
He said China is eating our lunch. That's what Trump said today. We've been feeding them a long time.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Ken Griffin, Citadel CEO, spoke earlier today at the Qatar Economic Forum in Doha and shared his thoughts on the Biden administration's economic policies regarding LNG and EVs and some thoughts on Donald Trump as well. Take a listen.
Well, it's sort of a continuation of the incoherent economic policies of the Biden administration. We've seen this giant push towards green energy over the course of the last several years. And at the same time, a set of policies that run completely contrary to the stated goal of trying to head towards a zero carbon world. And placing enormous tariffs on Chinese EVs, which are low cost, high quality, of great value to American consumers, is yet another part of the incoherent Biden economic strategy. The other part of the strategy that I scratch my head about is the U.S. refusing to provide new LNG permits. Right? If you want the world to head towards a lower carbon footprint and move away from coal, access to LNG is a really important part of the equation. And yet the United States is refusing to permit new facilities in the foreseeable future.
And also to sell LNG to countries with which the United States doesn't have a free trade agreement.
That's a part of the equation also.
You've been a prominent donor, I would say, to Republican candidates. I'd like to know, how are you going to spend your money? How are you already spending your money ahead of the election in November?
So I have been a significant supporter of Republicans that stand for personal freedom, national security, and economic soundness in the United States. That has been a big focus of mine in this primary election, or this primary cycle. I want to see people in the House and in the Senate that represent the best of American values and backgrounds that prepare one to serve in public service. In the last election cycle, I supported a number of people who were veterans and who are now serving our country in the House, and they do it with the pride that our country deserves, and they do it with the integrity that our country needs. So I've been very focused on finding candidates who I think represent the best of American values to be part of the future of the Republican Party.
People probably want to know, have you donated to Donald Trump's campaign, either directly or indirectly, to a PAC or a super PAC?
I have not.
Will you?
I'm going to wait to see who he picks as his VP candidate.
Is there anyone whom you'd like to see him pick as his VP candidate?
I don't. This is, again, like poking the bear. Not sure which way my recommendation goes in terms of helping that person's prospects.
Citadel CEO Ken Griffin earlier today at the Qatar Economic Forum. And joining us now with more is our political panel, Sarah Chamberlain, Republican Main Street Partnership CEO, and Kristen Hawn, Rokk Solutions partner. So he was talking there, ladies, about vice presidential picks. He wants to see who it will be. Certainly, we saw a whole host of them in one place today, up in New York, outside the courthouse at Donald Trump's hush money trial. North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum, Byron Donalds, the congressman from Florida, even Vivek Ramaswamy, who at one point was running against Donald Trump for the Republican nomination. The Veep Stakes has gone on the road, Kristen.
It has gone on the road, and it was interesting to see. I mean, and there's also, he's got the, Donald Trump can't say everything that he wants to say, so he's definitely pulling out all of his surrogates. I think you can see the Republicans, even the Speaker of the House, who are rallying around their candidate because he is their presumptive nominee.
There's someone else I think you didn't mention who was there.
You're right.
That was on purpose, I bet. The Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, showed up at court today and spoke with reporters outside. Let's give it a listen.
I'm an attorney. I'm a former litigator myself. I am disgusted by what is happening here, what is being done here to our entire system of justice overall. The people are losing faith right now in this country, in our institutions.
Sarah, I'm guessing this is not what you wanted to talk about when you woke up this morning, but is that the best use of the Speaker's time? What's he doing in New York?
It is not what I wanted to talk about, but here we are. Oh, joy. I'm not surprised the Speaker was there. I mean, he certainly felt it was the best use of his time to go in. I mean, Donald Trump is going to be the Republican nominee, so they have to go and defend him. And because he can't say much, because he keeps getting charged for the things he says, that he's brought in surrogates to do just that as Biden is out on the campaign trail. But I do want to highlight, the more he's in court, the more Biden is out there. The polls are showing that people are turning more and more towards Trump.
Well,
it's interesting.
We'll get to Biden in a minute, but you just were saying there essentially that the Speaker is out there defending Donald Trump. Was he not also out there because he wants Donald Trump to defend him in turn against, whatever Marjorie Taylor Greene decides to do next?
Absolutely. I think that was kind of a thank you to the Marjorie Taylor Greene, what happened last week. So he can't blame the Speaker. He wants to keep his job. And everybody else wants to be the vice president. So it's an interesting time to watch this.
They even have the wardrobe figured out already.
They do.
In advance. Well, interesting here, Sarah, because the fact is Joe Biden is struggling in the polls, even as the former president sits in a courtroom. We heard from Siena this week, Siena College, that shows him losing in 5 of 6 swing states. The stock market is up 25% since the beginning of this criminal trial. And the Biden campaign has spent tens of millions of dollars on ads. What are we learning?
I mean, I think the Biden campaign's also just starting to ramp up. Any of us who are on the receiving end of all the messaging that they're doing, really ramping up, particularly in these swing states, to deliver the message that he needs to deliver before election time. I think a lot of it defies logic that the former president is, on trial, but he's got, he's got this personal message. I call it Trump identity politics. Like Democrats a lot of times are criticized for using identity politics, but people are also looking at the economy. And so the president needs to do a good job of getting out there and talking to voters, particularly in these swing states.
I should qualify, by the way, up 25% since the last Siena poll, which was in November. What a stark number for Joe Biden.
Absolutely. And to your point about him needing to get out there, not just to swing states, but potentially use the Rose Garden, we saw him speaking from there earlier today on his decision to impose higher tariffs on Chinese imports.
Folks, look, I'm determined that the future of electric vehicles will be made in America by union workers, period.
There's the higher tariff on EVs goes to 102.5% on all EVs coming from China. Guess targeting the union workers in Michigan, for example, also on steel and aluminum, maybe targeting that steel union in the state of Pennsylvania. Is this what the president needs to do, Kristen?
I mean, I think it's a huge component of what he needs to do. He needs to be talking about what he's doing. He's clearly got an audience there. He's talking to these union workers. He's talking to a specific industry that can drive people to the polls. Now, as somebody who's worked in Democratic politics for a really long time, are these actual voters who are Democratic voters? Are they going to vote for the president? I think he still has to make the case. It's not just the case anymore that union voters are automatically going to go to the polls and vote for the Democrat.
Yeah, it's interesting here. This is Trump's lane. Tariffs. This was one of the most controversial things in 2018. The Biden administration today tacitly endorsing Donald Trump's approach by not lowering any of the Trump-era tariffs. They just hiked a few more. Is it possible, take the names out of this, for a politician to encroach on someone else's brand on that level? Can Joe Biden convince people he's serious?
Well, that's a great question. It's interesting. Donald Trump, whether you like the man or not, some of his policies, which President Biden proved today, were very good and were very good for the country. And this just added to that. So, I mean, Biden did the right thing. We have to bring the chips home. We have to make more things here in America. And I think COVID really showed that. And
you have two parties now that are pro-tariff.
We do. We do.
Everyone is a China hawk.
Right. Yeah. Everyone. China sells out there. So let's just be honest. Politically, being anti-China sells. And it constantly does. It fires up the Republican base and it fires up the Democratic base. So this is one area where they could come together on.
Great conversation, and we're not done with it. With our panel, we'll break down, I should say, next what to expect from tonight's primaries. Yeah, it's primary day. Maryland, West Virginia, and more. We'll talk about it next with our panel on Balance of Power on Bloomber TV and radio.
I'm David Trone, and I'm running for the Senate. I don't have a slogan. I don't have a single campaign flyer, but I do have the podium, and I intend to use it. I've made headway, but it's not enough. When you grow up on a farm lost to the bank, you learn there's no shame in asking for help, but there is in not helping. I'm going to use the podium to do just that.
We know Maryland, and we know Angela is the Democrat who will win.
I'm Angela Also Brooks. I approve this message. Now let's get to work.
A sample of campaign ads from Maryland Democratic senatorial candidates David Trone and Angela Also Brooks as they fight to be their party's nominee to run against Larry Hogan, the former Republican governor who remains quite popular in Maryland. If you live around here in the Washington area, you've seen those ads. And back with us now is our political panel. Sarah Chamberlain, Republican Main Street Partnership CEO, alongside Kristen Hawn, partner at Rokk Solutions. This is really something, Kristen, to see Democrats taking sides here. You've got the Maryland party establishment, beginning with the Governor Wes Moore on to down to Steny Hoyer, Senator Chris Van Hollen, all behind Also Brooks. David Trone, though, has a lot of money, and he has lent his own campaign more than $50 million of his own cash. What's more powerful in the outcome?
I mean, I think, you've got the Maryland political establishment, Democratic Party establishment, unlike some other states, is very powerful. They've got good political instincts. They've got they've run in the state many, many times. You look at somebody like Steny Hoyer. But you've got a candidate in David Trone who's had a lot of accomplishments. He also has the backing of some of the, national Democratic Party fixtures in D.C., which is interesting. But I think at the end of the day, a lot of money is going to be spent on this race, and his own personal fortune isn't necessarily going to make the difference.
Wow.
Well, and a lot of money will be spent on this race because it could be one of the deciding factors in the balance of the Senate.
Yep.
There's a real chance, Mitch McConnell was thrilled about it when Larry Hogan decided to run, that this could actually become a Republican Senate seat. Who can Larry Hogan beat more easily, Sarah?
So full disclosure, I'm very close for Larry Hogan. He's a very active Main Streeter. I prefer it to be Trone. I think white man and white man would be easier. And I think that Larry has the best chance of winning there. I think the African-American vote maybe comes over to him. He was extremely popular in that community when he was the governor. So that's who I'm rooting for tonight. It doesn't matter as much about the money. I don't think you can buy these seats anymore. Republicans will certainly go in with lots of money as well, but that's my hope today. We'll see. And I kind of like the fact the Democratic Party is kind of split in Maryland, just saying. I'm a Republican. Right. An opportunity.
Well, that's fascinating. It seems like we are learning then in this era of social media, what we've seen Donald Trump do when it comes to earned media. That money does not play the role it once did in politics. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, it's fair to say. We're seeing this on the presidential level. President Biden is outraising Trump, but he's falling further behind in the polls. Yeah. So money doesn't do it. They get used to.
On the other, I would say just at the end of the day, you have to have the boots on the ground. You have to have people knocking on doors and getting people to the polls, and you have to have money to do that. But otherwise, I would agree.
Organizing.
Indeed. And David Trone has spent literally tens of millions of dollars on this primary effort.
Yes.
And we'll see the outcome
That's
tonight.
wine money, right?
It is,
Founder
which we probably
wine
contribute
chain.
to.
So have a wine and a cigar while you're watching the results.
Right.
All right. Sarah Chamberlain, Kristen Hawn, our wonderful political panel. We don't have wine here, unfortunately, but thank you for joining us all the same. And of course, for more coverage of everything from Maryland to the rest of the country, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the Terminal and online.
We'll be toasting you as the results come in. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.